Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your test. A full textbook, tons of ACT questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today, we have Ravi Bhatia from Ashland Prep with us. And Ravi, I'd love if you could just introduce yourself briefly.
Sure. Thanks, Tyler. As you said, my name is Ravi. I am the founder of Ashland Prep. We're based in Venice, California. We're an online education company focusing on helping students manage their emotions in the test prep process, and then also, circling into college consulting and academics as well. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, fantastic. Glad to have you here. And today we're going to be talking about how to shop for tutors, right? For SAT and ACT, but probably just generally too. And I'm curious, kind of as one of those people, right? Where do you want to start?
It's so funny. I'm glad we're starting there, actually. I think, well, first of all, the way I approach things is I kind of have my own built-in filter for clients. So, you can see where I am in my office. Todd, you want to describe my office for the group? What you're looking at right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm guessing correctly, I think it's your garage.
Yep. Yeah. I am in my garage in my office in Venice. I've got a whiteboard behind me. I've got a blackboard on the side, and it's deliberately
a happy
janky.
Father's Day photo in the back.
Oh yeah, you can see that. That's so cool. Yeah. But this is basically really me. You don't see any crazy advertising, but you also don't see anything fancy. It's very down to earth here. And there are families who will look at my office and be like, why isn't it somewhere, a little more high end looking? And then there are other families who really appreciate the organic nature of what I'm bringing to the table. And for me, it's an automatic filter. And some families, they know when they see me, they don't want it. They don't want the backwards cap. They don't want the flannel shirt. They want something a little more, for lack of a better way of saying it, professional looking.
Yeah.
And so I filter that out myself. And I think, for families, understanding that vibe is really important. And tutors are, like me, are probably very deliberate about the image they're projecting when you meet them for the first time.
Right. Well, and I think that's maybe the first point then, or at least kind of taking away from that is at the end of the day, you need to find the person that's the right fit either for you or for your kid. And that is really kind of like a culture fit almost, right? To use the tech lingo.
Yeah, the culture fit is arguably the most important. And first of all, I think even before thinking about trying to find the right tutor, questioning the premise about whether or not a tutor is the best route for your student in the first place in this environment. You and I had talked previously about how there's never been a better time to take the ACT and SAT because of the optionality of submitting scores and also the amount of crazy great resources that are out there for students to study on their own. Ironically, as a tutor myself, I don't think I would personally do as well with the tutor. I would actually much prefer to self-study and get things wrong on my own because I can get a little self-conscious myself when I make mistakes. I don't necessarily trust that every tutor will know how to handle that sort of thing. But, thinking about your student, how they work, and then questioning that aspect and asking your student is a really, really great place to start. And I think the asking your student component is something that doesn't necessarily happen as much as it should. Because in the end, the student who will have the most success in studying for these tests are the ones who actually take ownership over the process and can be the ones who make those decisions. And my company, we encourage that as part of that process. But there's a lot of companies that wouldn't necessarily do that because it adds a layer of complexity to the whole thing. And so you as a family have to consider that as well. Like, how can I put this in my students' hands and sort of trust them to do it? And like I said, there's never been a better time to do that because the stakes aren't, you can either submit or not submit. So you might as well have your student be the one engaging and driving that decision in the first place.
Well, out of those things that you just said, the thing that really that I really stuck with me was you said that basically you should be trying to figure out what kind of learner that your child is, right? When you were trying to figure out what kind of tutor would be best for them or whether a tutor would work or not.
Yep.
And I think that's a really good point because frankly, I imagine that so many people or so many of people that come talk to you, it's just like, oh, like, my kid wants to go to X college. Usually it's some huge reach, right? And it's like, well, they need this SAT score, and the SAT score is really far away, and they're not getting there, so we just need to find a tutor, right? Like little Timmy is like struggling with math. We just need to get him a tutor, right? They don't think about like, well, what about the agency of the learner in this, right? Like, what about what works best for them or kind of like what they think they need, right? I think a lot of times it's just parents kind of dictating it. So
yeah.
I feel like that's a really good point.
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, and on that subject too, when you think about the tutoring situation, that scenario with the family who wants to send their kid to, the school that they went to, a top Ivy League or whatever it may be, it forces them to look objectively at their student's overall profile and be like, hey, is this even the right thing for my student in the first place? If he's not willing to, and this I think is a critical point as well too. If your student is not willing to take an initial practice test to figure out where they are in the process, is spending thousands of dollars on test prep the right avenue for them? Right? Is that the way that you want to actually force your student to do it? And then, what'll end up happening in those scenarios is there are lots of companies out there who will gladly, have students go through that whole process. And, even when they're not necessarily motivated by it. And, that's a really tricky line to cross because, tutoring companies need to pay their bills. And families are more than happy to do something because of, a friend did so well with their student, right? And so, where was I with this? I just think that we have to really be careful about understanding whether the student even has that in them in the first place and to celebrate them if they don't. And, a critical point here too is like, okay, Johnny, you don't want to take this practice test? Totally fine. The company director says that, the test prep company director says that, it'll take around 50 to 100 hours to do well on test prep. So how are you going to spend that time instead if you're not going to do test prep? What are you going to do instead? And I think framing things that way is, you're still giving your student agency and you're recognizing the opportunity cost of, doing test prep, and you're respecting their wishes. And I think everybody wins. But the obvious challenge is it's so unconventional to think that way that I think a lot of families will be really skeptical of that particular approach.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also important to like kind of frame the conversation around like what are tutors good for? Like what is the point of a tutor versus a self-study course or, doing nothing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what is a tutor good for? I think every tutor has their different strengths, but I would say that the one thing is that tutors it's never been less important for tutors to know content intimately down to the nuance. But it's never been more important for tutors to have a really high EQ and an understanding of where a student's coming from and the ability to match their energy. that's really where tutors are at. And so,
Hmm.
and I say that in terms of content because there is so much content. There is not a dearth of SAT or ACT content out there for free that any
Right.
student can use. And so, I was talking to a family yesterday. They were like, hey, do you have specialists for SAT math and SAT verbal? Which we, of course, do. But the reality of that question is like, unless your student's testing in the top 0.01 percentile or 1 percentile for each subject, that sort of level of expertise matters much less than what that tutor can do to bring out the best in your student.
Right.
Because the content is so readily available, and there's so many different ways to get it. But the ability to, think about your student's energy and then having the tutor and be able to match that. So if a student is very soft spoken, a really abrasive, not abrasive, but like rah
Pushy.
tutor,
Yeah.
pushy, rah, hyper energy, won't necessarily work there. And even if that tutor has amazing results with so many other students. And so, again, just considering your student and less about the reputation of the tutor.
Yeah. I also think that there's something to be said for, like, to loop back to what we were talking about earlier, just like, what does your student need, right? Like, what does your child need? Do they need help with organization skills, with time management skills? Do they need help with motivation and engagement, right? Like, I think that there's a big difference in that in terms of, like, because tutors can provide those things or teach those things alongside, like, the subject matter material, but not everyone does, or not everyone teaches all of them.
Right. And, and from my perspective, a lot of the families who choose our company, uh, they recognize that there's more of an emotional need than a content need already. And they have evidence of that for years and years and years and years. Like maybe a lot of the thing that you see right now is, during COVID, a lot of students who are taking geometry feel very weak at geometry. And so they'll
Mhm.
blame the content, but the reality is COVID was a very traumatizing time for a lot of these students. And the association of that time with geometry is the actual primary concern. And so
Right.
when you can separate that and identify the actual root cause, for some students, it really actually might be the content. But for the students that tend to work with our company, it tends to be more of the emotional association and getting through that. And so,
Right.
yeah.
I mean, COVID set pretty much everybody in those classes back like a year at least, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's what the data shows.
Oh, yeah.
And it's kind of almost like a year and a half. And I think that, it's I'm not an expert in this specific topic, but, like, I feel like there's such a difference between, like, people who went through COVID in, like, first grade and people who went through COVID in fifth grade versus, like, eighth grade or, 10th grade or something like that, right? Like, I think that that really has, and because the thing is, everything that you learn in school, you kind of learn on the back of what you already learned,
Yeah.
right? And the school, for better or for worse, you could argue kind of to keep up the illusion that everything's fine, or you could say that, they don't really have a choice, but they just kind of kept the train rolling. So now maybe you're weak in geometry because you learned it on Zoom and you weren't really paying attention because you and your friends are all texting each other or whatever. And then now you are trying to do algebra 2 on top of that, right? Or whatever. And you're building a house on a shaky foundation. And I just think that, this is going to be something that parents and students will have to deal with for the next kind of 5 to 10 years or so while this works its way out of the system.
Yeah.
Um,
And, the theory about how, not even a theory, it's actually a fact, I think, how most of the development occurs early, right, in terms of
mhm.
academic and intellectual development. So I'm really curious to see, for better or for worse, the kids who are in first and second grade and kindergarten now, how that 1.5 years impacted them in terms of their development longer term. Um, you
Yeah.
know,
Well,
it'll be
we will see. Smarter people than us will be figuring it out.
absolutely way smarter people.
Well, yeah, but to get back to tutors, so it sounds like just like talking to you about this, it seems like there's sort of a particular rapport that you have with your students, and that it seems like a lot of what you're working on is like helping them build confidence, right? And that's such an important part of actually like of test prep and of doing well on tests.
Yeah, that's our approach, and we tend to be more collaborative in nature as opposed to authoritative. And
Hmm.
there are certainly students who do really well with authority figures um, in their lives, pushing them in that regard. And so I think, again, going back to what your student um, is like and what they respond to. And, I think the first step for any family is actually talking to their student,
Hmm.
using it as an opportunity to get a handle and understand where they're at. And that 20 to 30-minute conversation can save thousands of dollars. It can save a lot of headache. It can provide an open communication um, thing, for a lack of a better way of saying it, that they may not have
Hmm.
had before with each other. And, again, I'm painting a rose colored lens. This conversation may be a little more intense than I'm making it out to be. But if you think about it this way, is 20 or 30 minutes of your time talking to your student about, what their learning is like, how they actually want to approach testing, and then going
Hmm.
into the process of finding a tutor or a resource collaboratively. Um,
Yeah, I also just think that there's like this is something that I think parents should do anyways, right? I think it'll be helpful with their academics too. And in general, like the goal is to find alignment, right? I think that that's
mhm.
if there's kind of one word for today, it's like how to shop for a tutor. Well, look for alignment, right? And I mean that can be alignment on like what they're going to be learning, or
Mhm.
like their teaching, like the teaching style or the focus of the firm or the individual tutor on like different aspects of it, like you're focusing on the confidence aspect of it. And I just think that like you can't make all those decisions unilaterally for your kid without talking to them first, because they're getting old enough where they're gonna have an opinion, and hopefully a thoughtful one about it, right? Like you.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah.
what's funny is, to be fair, I have worked with some parents who have unilaterally made decisions on behalf of their kids and have done that for their entire lives. And it worked. But the requirement to do that is just a ton of energy. And it may have worked for, you know, the college admissions process, but then what happens when that student goes to college?
Hmm.
Um, so that's something to consider as well too. Is the whole goal of tutoring, somewhat ironically, should be to help foster that independence and help students take that agency on the way to college. So there's a bigger picture here as well too. It's not just
Hmm.
tutoring as a means to an end for the scoring. It's as a means to like really help students start gaining that independence and get a fresh start with that if you haven't been as good as that but want to start. Because with
Yeah.
testing, it's relatively, the stakes are high, but there's low risk, meaning like if you don't do as well, it's not a big deal. So there's everything
Hmm.
to gain and nothing to lose by having your student make those mistakes and miss lessons on occasion and like, learn how to be independent without you on top of them all the time.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think also it's just a matter of like, are you dictating that your child is doing test prep and doing all this stuff, or is it like a collaborative thing? And, again, like different families are going to have different approaches to that. But yeah, I think certainly for me at least, I like the collaborative approach a lot more, because at the end of the day, if my kid, who doesn't exist yet, but someday, if my kid is anything like me, he will not want to do it unless he's intrinsically motivated to do it himself.
Right. Yeah, and I have that too. And I think for a lot of students, the family is like, well, my student won't be intrinsically motivated. And I'll be like, okay, if they're getting great grades, there's something motivating them. And the problem might not be about the lack of intrinsic motivation. It's a lack of understanding about, the why behind it and, what it can take. And so a part of our process is actually talking to the students directly before doing test prep and helping them understand where they can go using data they've already had. We rarely accept students who won't take a practice test beforehand because, that shows that, hey, this is not necessarily the right avenue if you're not willing to spend 4 hours on a practice test. Hours with a tutor won't necessarily save you. So yeah, it's a really interesting and fun conversation to have with families. And I think a lot of families feel pretty refreshed when they recognize that, oh, wow, even though my friend Susie was all on top of my kids, I don't actually have to be. I can potentially be more hands-off and it can still work out well.
So I think we've really done a good job covering sort of like what we've covered so far on shopping for a tutor, right? And like the culture fit aspect and kind of like being like trying to kind of get your kid involved in the process and thinking about what's going to be best for them. But I'd also love to just kind of talk about the nuts and bolts and sort of the brass tacks stuff too. Like when it comes to price, for instance, sort of how do you recommend people shop for tutors in terms of price, right? I guess because for me, I feel like either you kind of have a budget and then you go find something under that budget, or you look for everything nearby and then try to figure out of those options which one makes the most sense from like a price benefit standpoint. That's my guess. That's kind of how people shop for this. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts or advice for parents on how to do that.
Yeah, for sure. So once you've had that conversation with your student and you've recognized their intrinsic motivation, I think the next step is understanding, how much college could potentially cost you. So, if you're a family making less than $100,000 a year, but your student's getting straight A's, a lot of private schools that you apply to may pay your full tuition. But if you're above a certain range, let's say you're in that, I call it the no man's land, where you're doing really well financially, but not enough to pay $100,000 a year for a school like NYU.
Right. Which I think is probably a lot of people.
A lot of people.
That
right?
category is probably like 70-80% of applicants to most places. Yeah.
Right. And that area, I think it's like, okay, I know I have a student that is intrinsically motivated. And I know college, I'm willing, even though, and I wouldn't recommend this necessarily to almost anybody. I think, there's a whole different conversation to be had about the ROI of paying full price to private schools and public schools and things like that. But if you are at the point where you say, I am ready and willing to spend this much money on a school, no matter what your financial situation may be, in that scenario, it's worth just finding the best tutor no matter what, because no tutor is going to compare to the cost of that college. And you might as well try to find, the tutor that can get them there with the best chances. So find the best tutor first and then worry about the price later in that scenario. However, that doesn't have to be the case, right? And I think one thing is the perspective that the best tutors are also the highest price is absolutely not true.
Right.
You can definitely
And you say this as a pretty expensive one.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I'm not the right fit for everybody. I'm just not. And again, I have enough experience to have a very deliberate background where when people talk to me, they know right away if I'm the right fit or not.
Right.
And that's great. But
yeah, I'd love for you to expand on the most expensive tutor is not always right. Because I think that one of the things that we find interesting, even when we're doing Achievable test self-serve courses, right,
Hmm.
is like people assume that more expensive courses are better.
Yep.
And we've like it's not true at all. A lot of times those expensive ones are kind of resting on their laurels, and I feel like sort of tutoring's probably in a very similar boat.
Yeah, I think it absolutely can be. But sometimes those laurels are right for a student, and a
Hmm.
lot of the times they may not be. And so sometimes a family will be potentially blinded by the reputation of a tutor in their neighborhood and so grateful for that tutor's willingness to take a student on that they don't
Right.
necessarily think about what's right for the student. So, I think there are diamonds in the rough here, and I think the way to think about that is like, generally speaking, newer tutors, a lot of families don't want that experience. But I'll give
Hmm.
an analogy with our nanny search. We have a 1 year old daughter who's been amazing, and we were searching for nannies. And our first instinct was to find the most experienced nanny in the same way that the most experienced nanny in the same way that a lot of families want the most experienced tutor. Uh,
Right.
we found right away that for our family and the way we did things, and we thought we had a really good handle on our daughter, that the most experienced nannies who they just tended to not, they tended to have their own ways of doing things that were really set, just like you said, resting on their laurels, right? And like
Hmm.
kind of commanding us in ways that we didn't need necessarily, and operating under the premise that we didn't necessarily know what we were doing and they did because of all their experience. And that wasn't great for us, but it could have been great for somebody else, right? And so for
Hmm.
us, we actually found our niche as like, the nannies who were relatively new, who were willing to learn and like take instruction for us. That was a really good way to go. And I think if you are a family who recognizes that in yourself, if you're a parent who does have a good handle on the process and feels pretty confident, you don't want a person making you feel unconfident. You want that person you're choosing to celebrate that and even potentially go with that. And so for those families who are particularly savvy, they can find a really great low price tutor who's enthusiastic, who is fresh out of school, who is willing to, do things in a way that you may want. And you can find that on Wyzant. You can find that on numerous resources. You can talk to your own school and figure out who they recommend. But that's something to consider as well too. Is, hey, how savvy am I, and how much do I actually value experience at the expense of recognizing that this tutor is going to be set in their ways and not necessarily responsive to what my student needs?
Right. Well, and that's such it ties really well with, the main point that we made earlier, which is the goal here is to find like fit between your child and this tutor more so than it is to, go to whatever the famous tutor is in your neighborhood. Depending on where you live, you might not have a ton of options, right? But in
Mm-hmm.
areas like Los Angeles, and also frankly just through the internet, there are a lot more options than there used to be. And I mean, you were talking about you diamonds in the rough. I mean, it is pretty hard to find diamonds in the rough, and it can take like a lot of, interviewing different tutors. But for better or for worse, like there are like tutor directory websites like, Wyzant, Varsity Tutors. Achievable has one that doesn't take commission also
Yep.
that we just do as a free resource. And like some of the people on these sites are fantastic and they're relatively cheap, right? Could be like $75 an hour or something like that.
Yeah.
But they just are getting their business started or they're like a college student or whatever, right? Versus, and so sometimes that can be great, but you've got to do all the legwork yourself to like try
Mm-hmm.
and figure out who those people are and try to like interview them and like you've never bought a tutor for the before unless you're on like your second kid doing this or something. So it's hard, but it is possible. I would also say like there are other ways to find tutors, right? I mean, what are some like I mean, I think referrals is a big one, like if people worked for other students, your friends kids, right?
Yeah.
What are some ways like that are good avenues to find tutors?
Yeah, I think the number one way that we get clients is through referrals. And
Mm-hmm.
I love referrals specifically because I know that the client that's referring is going to refer people they think will find my particular service valuable. And so if I'm a family, I would absolutely do referrals. What I wouldn't necessarily do, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, is they see the valedictorian who got a perfect score,
Mm-hmm.
and their student doesn't really have a relationship with that valedictorian and may not even like that valedictorian. But
Mm-hmm.
then because that valedictorian did so well, they choose that kid's process thinking they can replicate it. That's where it gets the referral thing will fall apart because you're considering what worked for somebody else's student who isn't like your student. But if
Mm-hmm.
that student has a great friend on the track team and he's a year older and he did really well with this particular tutor, that's a really good sign. That's a really great place to start. And so I would focus more on the actual friends, not the actual result, because the
Mm-hmm.
result is a combination of so many different factors um, that can go into it. Like basically any tutor who has their own business can write a full list of success stories, but there's also, skeletons in the closet of students who didn't do as great. Um, and there are always reasons for it. And, just understanding that having a person doesn't guarantee results, but you're going to get to a better start by working, by getting referrals from friends who have students who are very much like minded with your student. Thinking about that first, not the valedictorian who you may or may not really like that much.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, this is all really good advice. Any kind of closing thoughts here as we wrap up?
Closing thoughts. I think we'll reiterate the fact that, it may seem confusing, but basically, I think the long story short of it is that the more time you're willing to put into it, the more likely you can find diamonds in the rough. The same way that if you're willing to work on your car yourself, you can save money.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I think recognizing the value of your time is a really important part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you happen to have a recommendation from a few people that seem totally great, people you respect, you don't necessarily need to overthink it if everything works out well from that regard and you have a conversation, it looks and it feels great. Um, and the core of it too is that if it doesn't feel great, even though everyone else is saying it's great, trust that instinct.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to educational outcomes and the SATs and data, a lot of families will ask questions like, what is the average improvement of your students, right? And the reality is that question isn't necessarily a fair question to your own student because you have to really consider their own willingness to put in the work and their own motivational drive and all of those things. And so focusing on the qualitative factors of, personality and fit, which is not as quantifiable over the data is, I think,
Mm-hmm.
the primary way I would try to find a tutor.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Ravi Bhatia from Ashland Prep. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me and use the code podcast to get 10% off at checkout. And Achievable has a tutor directory also on our site that is completely free, and you can go there at achievable.me.